Social Studies for elementary teachers. This is lecture I-1. This lecture series will look at war and the phenomenon of war, and this first one looks specifically at the problem of war, what war is. As we begin a close look at war, there are a few objectives that you will achieve by listening to this lecture, by being able to identify what war is and what differentiates it between other types of violence. This lecture is recorded in April of 2011, and at the time there is much debate over whether or not the United States or Israel is going to, or even should, attack Iran's nuclear research facilities. The question of going to war is never a light matter, but there are a few arguments that suggest that violence or military action is appropriate in this case. The main argument is that Iran is not cooperating with the International Atomic Energy Agency. In years past, Iran has been caught cheating. They are enabled to pursue nuclear technology for peaceful uses, but they can only do so if they fully disclose that effort to the IAEA. They began their research facility without any disclosure, and only after they were caught did they admit to it. They then said that their research was for peaceful use only, but they have very little credibility on this issue because they attempted to do it secretly. In addition, Iran is constantly bragging about their uranium enrichment capability. Their bragging exceeds their actual capability. They say they have more than they do, but the fact that they are not just proud, but are promoting the idea that they can produce lots and lots of uranium at a really high percentage, much higher than is necessary for a nuclear research facility, suggests that they have goals other than peaceful nuclear energy. Finally, they have in the past threatened Israel's existence, which leads us to be concerned that if the West waits too long before it attacks Iran, Iran will develop an indigenous ability to design and produce weapons, and at that point it will be too late for an attack to have any impact. There are equally compelling arguments against attacking Iran as well. First of all, there is no imminent capability to produce weapons. Even if Iran wants to produce weapons, they're years away from doing so. It's a huge gap between saying you want to have nuclear weapons and actually having nuclear weapons. And so there's no urgency in this at all. There's no evidence that they can make weapons, only that there's evidence that it looks like they're trying to. So we're several years away from any real threat coming from Iran in the nuclear arena. In addition, Iran does in fact have the right to pursue nuclear energy under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and they publicly claim that they have no intent to make weapons. And so, since they have the legal right to do so, it's difficult to justify a military attack based on their current actions. Finally, there's no easy way to eliminate Iran's ability to do nuclear research or develop their nuclear weapons, as their nuclear facilities are dispersed, and some of them are hardened, meaning they are underground or have significant concrete shells, so that a military attack is no simple matter. Part of the decision of whether or not to attack is to evaluate the costs of action versus the cost of inaction. Now, the cost of action, meaning if there was an attack on Iran, it's important to understand that this would be no surgical strike. Because their facilities are dispersed and hardened, this would be a broad-based, sustained attack. And now, such an attack would require eliminating the air defense systems that Iran has first. So an attack of this magnitude is not a surgical strike, it is war. So Iran's response would likely be threefold. They would probably shut down the Strait of Hormuz with mines and missiles. This picture on the left here is an example of Iran's speedboat capability. That to close the Strait of Hormuz, the Iranian regime would probably rely on sea mining and so-called swarm tactics, which would aim to saturate the U.S. defense systems by using large numbers of small disposable boats. These are pictures of the Revolutionary Guard's allegedly stealthy flying boats. So those shutting down the Straits of Hormuz with these swarm attacks, missiles, and mines would severely damage the global economy because it would essentially shut down the oil exports from the Gulf. In addition, Iran would likely attack Israel and U.S. bases and interests in the region with medium-range ballistic missiles, and they would likely use proxies to attack Israel and U.S. interests in Lebanon, Syria, and the Palestinian territories. So an attack on Iran would have questionable outcome and would result in significant costs and responses from Iran. Now, there are also costs of inaction if we do not attack Iran. To not attack means that Iran will likely gain a nuclear ability sometime in the future. Again, it's several years ahead, but it is down the road if they were to continue. Now, Iran would likely use that nuclear ability to trigger disputes with Israel and other neighbors. Not necessarily that it would use those nuclear weapons, because to do so would be suicidal, but it would use the threat of those weapons to draw Israel and the United States into a negotiating dynamic that would not be favorable to the U.S. or Israel. It would, by challenging the United States and by challenging Europe and getting away with it, essentially, which is what will happen if they gain their nuclear abilities, Iran's bid for a regional hegemony would be strengthened. This would weaken Saudi Arabia and Iraq. So there are fairly significant long-term consequences to not attacking Iran and allowing them to continue to develop their weapon systems. As you can see, these issues are complicated. There are costs of action and there are costs of inaction. There are reasons to act and there are reasons to not act. The war is one of the hardest policy issues a leader has to deal with because the stakes are so high. Now, for this same reason, war is one of the key issues of international relations. Now, this lecture examines the phenomenon of violence in anarchy that we call war. The question of what causes war and how to prevent it is the perennial question for scholars of international relations. In fact, the discipline of international relations owes its origin to efforts to answer this question. For many scholars of world politics, this issue is foremost in their minds. Now, there are, however, almost as many answers to this question as there are scholars asking it. Some point to power disparity in the international system, others suggest human greed or an animalistic territorialism. Still others suggest political systems based on tyranny, capitalism, oppression, or patriarchy. So this topic is a large one and covers many different aspects. As the United States has now been at war for years, many of these topics may already be familiar to you. Now let's begin by looking at war as a phenomenon of political violence. And we need to first distinguish between war and other kinds of political violence. And we need to do that in order to better understand them, to be able to do the kinds of statistical analysis or causal reasoning to really make sense of war. We have to know what is war and what is not war. For example, the picture on the left is a military unit in the Korean War. That's definitely war. But on the right, we have mob violence during the Kenyan elections. That's not war. It's violence. People get killed, and it's political violence, but it's not war. And so the dynamics that explain political violence in Kenya were probably going to be different than the dynamics that explain the Korean War. So it's important to make these distinctions, and to do that we need an agreed upon definition of what war is. The first element of a common agreed upon definition of war is that war is open armed conflict. It is declared typically between two states. It is not a secret amount. It's war that is ongoing. It is not a covert operation where you have special forces sneaking around during a time of peace. It's not diplomacy either. People are not talking to one another on a field. They are trying to kill each other. It is open armed conflict. So that's the first part of the definition. The next part is that war is about something, and it's usually about power or territory. War occurs when there are core national interests at stake. Wars typically do not erupt over an economic dispute, for example. But if one state seizes the territory of another state, so this is a picture here of the Gulf War when Saddam Hussein's Iraq attacked Kuwait and attempted to annex that country into a province of Iraq. The rest of the world responded with an assault to remove those troops. It was a war about territory. Often the war is about who's in charge, particularly civil wars, which we'll talk about in another lecture. So this is the second point of this general definition, is they're about something, usually power and territory. The next component of war is that they involve centrally organized fighters and fightings. Now, this means that you have armies, people wearing uniforms. This is a picture of the Kosovo Liberation Army after they got their uniforms. Now, this is a way to distinguish between an uprising versus a war. Now, prior to the KLA getting their uniforms, that was more of a rebellion or an uprising because they were separate groups. They didn't have uniforms. They didn't have standardized weapons. They did not have a centralized command structure that would tell this group to attack here and that group to attack there. Instead, they were just groups of individuals resisting what they saw as Serb oppression. And so once the KLA coalesced into a unified fighting force, then you could argue that that conflict became a war. So it's another key component to what distinguishes war from other types of conflict, is the organizational structure of the forces that are fighting it. The next component is that there is continuity between clashes. This means that war is not episodic violence, where there might be a clash and then a year later there might be another attack, and 2 years after that there's a reprisal attack. That doesn't feel like a war. And so part of the definition is that a war has continuity, where there's an attack followed by another attack, followed by a counterattack. It's a constant state of open armed conflict between the two sides. This is another reason why terrorism is not considered war in the traditional sense and by analysts of international conflict, because of this lack of continuity. Finally, the last component of this definition of war from an analytical point of view is a threshold of 1,000 battle deaths. So at least 1,000 people have to die in battle, not from sickness or dysentery or lack of food, but as a result of weapons or an anger. So that 1,000 is an arbitrary number, and everybody knows that it's an arbitrary number, but it's used to set a threshold that is useful for analysis. So anything below 1,000 deaths is not seen as meeting the definition of war. Anything more than 1,000 battle deaths, if it meets these other criteria, is considered a war. And again, that's arbitrary, but if 1,000 people die, it feels like a war. Where if there's a clash between two opposing military forces and 20 people die on one side and 10 people die on the other side, that's violence, and it's political violence, and it may meet all of the other criteria, but it doesn't quite constitute war. And so explaining that behavior might use different variables than explaining a war where 200,000 people died. So that 1,000 figure is an agreed upon definition between scholars of international relations. So using that definition of war then, war is declining. War is something that doesn't happen very much anymore. The world is a much more peaceful place than it used to be. Now, you might think that's crazy given how much news there is about conflict, but most of those conflicts are low-level, low-intensity conflicts. They may drag out for a long time, but they're not killing a whole lot of people. They may not be openly declared conflicts, so they're more ethnic conflicts or religious conflicts, or there might be civil conflicts that fall short of that 1,000 battle death. So this map here by Global Security shows where the wars are right now. And you see there aren't that many of them. There's really only one war on the map, and that is the North and South Korea. And that's because that war has never formally ended, and there is not necessarily continuity, but the conflict between them is a sustained conflict where there is fairly constant probing by the North, and there's fairly constant rebuffs of those probes by the South. So the South Koreans will sink a North Korean submarine, or the North Koreans will shell a military facility on an island owned by the South. And so that kind of thing happens on a fairly continuous annual basis. So we can consider that war is continuing to be ongoing. Proxy wars are where one state uses a non-state actor typically to make life miserable for their foe. And so there's a low-level terrorist conflict. That's what's considered a proxy war. And then civil wars are where these criteria are met, but they're not interstate wars. So there's no interstate wars in 2011. This map colors North Korea red, but most scholars don't consider that a full-scale war still. But there are upwards of 9 civil wars that are currently going. So it's helpful when thinking about political violence to know where to place that violence on a continuum. Now there's 2 types of political violence to focus on here. One is the internal intrastate conflict of civil wars, and we'll talk about those later. And the other is the external interstate conflict, and that's what we're focusing on in this lecture. And so if we think of a continuum of escalation, then we can categorize different types of violence or thresholds of reaching violence to be able to better understand war. So at the bottom of the interstate war escalation ladder would be a dispute. Now, as countries pursue their national interests in a world of finite resources, conflicts between those countries are inevitable. Interests are not always in harmony. Now, these disputes can be resolved in many ways, including peacefully. And in fact, most disputes are resolved through negotiation. So this would be the lowest level of escalation. Now, moving up one rung on the ladder of escalation is when one of those 2 sides in a dispute introduces a threat of force into that dispute. This could be an overt threat, such as issuing an ultimatum or giving a speech warning of some future action that's going to happen. So that's an overt threat of force. But it can also be a tacit threat of using military force, such as moving troops close to a border or moving a carrier task force off the shores. You haven't actually used force, but you've implied the use of force, and so that's a tacit militarization of that dispute. Perhaps flying a warplane to the edge of your opponent's airspace and then turning around. That's a militarized dispute. Here's a picture of a Japanese People's Liberation Army practicing amphibious assaults on a beach. Now, why would China do that? Well, China tends to conduct its amphibious assaults at the same time it's having political disputes with the island of Taiwan. And so they will hold a military exercise where they'll have their naval forces bear down on Taiwan and then turn around just outside the territorial waters and go across the strait to the Chinese mainland and then invade their own beach, to practice invading the beach. The message being sent is, we're getting ready to attack you. And it's a way to ratchet up pressure on the Taiwanese. So anytime that kind of action's going on, that is a militarized dispute where the threat of force is present, either overtly or tacitly. The next step on the escalation is reached when force is actually used. We're now no longer on the threat of force, but the actual violence has occurred. Weapons are fired in anger, and equipment is destroyed, and people may be killed. And these actions are often part of a larger strategy of ratcheting up pressure, or maybe taking revenge in a tit-for-tat way. But sometimes they occur accidentally as a result of militarization. So an example would be when the United States flew spy planes right up to the border of the military base in China of Hainan, and they intended to turn right at the border. The problem, though, is that where the Americans think the border is and where the Chinese think the border is don't match. And so the Chinese considered it as an incursion of their airspace. So they scrambled fighter jets, who then moved up to force the American planes to turn by moving their planes right next to them. And in the process of doing that, one of those planes bumped into the American plane, which destroyed the Chinese fighter jet, killing the pilot and crashing into the ocean, and forcing the American spy plane to make an emergency landing on the Chinese airbase. So occasionally force is used accidentally in the middle of a militarized dispute, but often force is used intentionally as a negotiation strategy, or like I said, as a tit-for-tat strategy. This is a picture of when the North Koreans bombed the islands held by the South Koreans. North Korea claims that those islands belong to them, but the South Koreans have been in possession of them since the end of the Korean War. And so North Korea, as a way to ratchet tension, moved its navy in, sunk a South Korean vessel, and bombed the facilities on the island, killing several civilians and several military personnel. So that is a clash. It's a limited engagement. It's not war. It hasn't killed 1,000 people, but it is using violence. The final stage on the escalation ladder is war itself. And here's where there's sustained violence that kills over 1,000 people. So all the definitions that we discussed earlier are met. Now, it's important to note that it is much harder to move down the escalation ladder than it is to go up. Escalation is easy. You just order your military to do something else. De-escalation is very difficult. Once war has begun, once violence has occurred, deaths have resulted, it's difficult for either side to back away from that without jeopardizing their political and military standing. So the ladder of escalation often only moves in one direction. So let's move to the question of why war happens. Now that we know what war is and the steps leading to war, why do countries do that? Why do they resort to this kind of violence? Now, there's a couple of different explanations, and it's a big question for international relations. And the answers are varied, and I actually recommend that you take a security course as part of your upper division work. There are entire classes that focus just on this question of why war happens, and I highly recommend that you do that. But for now, let's focus on just a couple of the more general answers provided by the two main paradigms of international relations. And so the realist paradigm argues that war is a result of the fact that we live in a world of scarcity, And in an environment of anarchy, that leads to conflicting interests. That conflict is inevitable. War then happens when the balance of power is in doubt. So when the balance of power is clear, as we discussed in an earlier lecture, a gross imbalance of power, the outcome is certain. The powerful state gets what they want, the weak state capitulates. When there's a clear balance of power, what typically happens is a negotiated outcome because neither side is willing to risk war. So a realist argues that war happens when one of those two sides has miscalculated, has misunderstood the proper balance of power, that the weak party thought it was stronger than it was, or the strong party thought it was weaker than it was. And so war then resolves that misunderstanding. The war demonstrates to all the reality of the balance. One side defeats the other. And at that point the war ends, because the defeated side, with a new correct understanding of the actual balance of power, knows that there's no point in continuing the war, and so they quit. And the strong side, also correctly now understanding the balance of power, knows that it does not need to use violence to get what it wants anymore, because it has demonstrated its superiority to the weak power. So at that point, war is not necessary, and the war ends. So that's a realist explanation of war. Idealists take a different approach. An idealist says, yes, conflict is inevitable due to a world of scarcity and in an environment of anarchy, but conflict can be peacefully resolved. It's a matter of negotiation. It's a matter of discussion. So for an idealist then, war is almost always avoidable. War is the result of miscalculation, miscommunication, or misperception. Somebody made a mistake, and that's what led to war. Which is why, from an idealist point of view, war should always be a last resort. To illustrate an idealist viewpoint on war, let's look at some classic explanations of misperception in war. And one of them is the rise of the cult of the offensive. And this happened after Otto von Bismarck demonstrated to Europe how effective modern war can be through the wars of German unification. The Prussians had a conscript army, so they had a citizenry that was trained and equipped and uniformed and ready to go. They also used a train mobilization schedule so that when war was declared, these citizen soldiers could follow their mobilization schedule. They would show up at the train station, they would get on the train, it would send them to the front, they would disembark from the train, go to their pre-assigned units, and arrive at the battlefield very quickly, fully trained, and rested because they didn't have to walk there. Now this was contrasted with the other nations of Europe that did not have the railway network that Prussia did, nor the training or doctrine to use mobilization patterns. And so when the Prussians would declare war on a state, the Prussians would immediately mobilize and show up with a full army in a couple of weeks, whereas the forces they were fighting were still busy putting uniforms on their peasants and teaching them how to march in straight lines by the time the Prussians showed up ready to go. So as a result, the Prussians quickly defeated the armies that they faced, and the wars of German unifications were, in a relative sense, quick, inexpensive, and bloodless. Now, this picture on the right is when the Prussians captured the French Emperor Napoleon III, and it was a humiliating defeat for the French. Now, many argue that this example that the Prussians had gave led many in Europe to fall into the cult of the offensive. Now, the word cult is used because it's implying that there is a misperception, a narrow way of thinking, a view of the world that's not accurate, but yet everyone buys into it together. And so the cult of the offensive then was that if you adopted a quick mobilization schedule and trained your troops and mechanized your soldiers, whoever mobilized first would win. And so countries put their focus on developing a quick offensive capability. Now, many argue that this led to World War I, because when the alliances began to shift, when the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated in Hungary, then the Germans backed the Hungarians against the Serbs, and the Serbs had their allies, and the Russians was the Serb allies, so Russia began to mobilize because they knew they were behind everybody else and it would take them longer. Once Russia mobilized, Germany mobilized because they knew that they had to defeat the Russians before they could fight anybody else, and so they couldn't wait for the Russians to mobilize. Once the Germans mobilized, the French mobilized because they weren't about to be embarrassed again, and the English mobilized so that they could have a hope of having an impact on the outcome. And so because everyone was so focused on mobilization, it led them to rush into this conflict. But it was a cult, meaning it was an incorrect understanding, because what happened was the war had changed while the perception of war had not. And so the countries of Europe mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops very quickly to the border, who were then gunned down by machine guns that had not been in use during the Bismarck Wars. And so trench warfare meant that defensive positions carried the day, not offensive positions. And so emplaced guns, entrenched infantry, hardened bunkers, those defeated every offensive wave and charge that was thrown against them. And tens of thousands of people were killed trying to engage on the offensive. And so the cult of the offensive was proven to be wrong at tremendous cost in World War I. So the lessons that were drawn was that the defensive would win all future wars, and a cult of the defensive replaced the cult of the offensive. That stalemate with entrenched machine guns meant that the way you avoid war is by building fortifications. And the idea was that whoever had the strongest defensive lines would be immune from attack. And so something that's not often recognized is that the French had the most advanced tank in the 1930s. This is a picture of the Renault Char D1. It beat the German tank in almost every measure as far as speed and distance of operation and accuracy of the gun and range of the gun. Had the French built lots and lots of these tanks, World War II might have been very different. But the French were not thinking in terms of what can you do with a tank. They were thinking in terms of how do we build better fortifications. And so the French built very few tanks. Instead, they poured most of their defensive resources into the Maginot Line, which was a series of concrete forts along the French and German border, because they had bought into this cult of defensive. The Germans then showed the error of this thinking with their blitzkrieg strategy. And what the Germans did was they used mechanized warfare to encircle and envelop defenses with tanks, infantry that were in close support of those tanks, and aircraft that could just fly over the fortified lines. And so they proved that the defensive was a cult. It was a false impression based on a previous experience. And so once again, a misperception on the part of one party helped contribute to the outbreak of war on the other party. Now these show that misperception led actors to make mistakes that led to war, or at least undermined their efforts to create a deterrent force, which a realist would argue could have prevented war. Now some argue that there are different military cults around in our day. For instance, there's a cult of air power, the idea that through using air power alone, you can win a war, that ground troops are not necessary. Or the shock and awe strategy as evidence of a cult of technology, that our troops have better toys than another troop and we're able to fight at night when no one else is, and that capability gives us an offensive and defensive ability that will intimidate others and prevent them from going to war with us, the United States. If that is true, then that's a great strategy. But some argue that that is a misperception. It's a modern-day cult. It's a cult of technology, that ground troops still carry the day, would be the counter-argument to that. Now, this lecture has introduced some of the key concepts in the study of war. Now, the Westphalian system always has the threat of force in the background, and so it's important to understand the dynamics of the use of that force. Now, the remaining lectures in this series will look at some of those dynamics and some of the specific topics of war and armed conflict. This lecture was provided courtesy of Dr. Brian Dilley. That's me. I'm a professor of political science at Mesa Community College.